On this edition of the Geopolitics and Empire podcast, we talk to Cory Doctorow, who is a well-known and prolific science fiction author, activist, journalist, co-editor of Boing Boing, and consultant to the Electronic Frontier Foundation. We'll be talking about internet freedom, privacy in the age of surveillance capitalism, the EU copyright directive, and the Chinafication of the internet. And before we get to Cory, let me just remind listeners that if you enjoy the podcast, please do us a simple favor and leave a rating and review on iTunes or wherever you listen to us. And I'd like to thank a recent listener for their review of Geopolitics and Empire, calling the podcast top-notch and, quote, as a geography and public policy college student, this podcast has served as an excellent resource for analysis of the most important geopolitical topics in the world today. I especially enjoy the caliber of guests which are featured, end quote. And now to our guest. Thanks for coming on the podcast, Cory.
Oh, it's absolutely my pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
And, there were a couple of themes I wanted to talk to you about, as I mentioned in the intro. But to set the stage, I wanted to mention how when I was in junior high school in the USA in the mid-1990s, I got my first desktop computer, and it was such an amazing time on the internet. It was a completely open road, open highway, total freedom, like the Wild West, and we had the freedom to explore every nook and cranny of the uncensored internet, no matter how weird it was. But now, after some 20-odd years, things are taking a sharp kind of Orwellian turn, and we're seeing sort of a breakdown of the global internet. China's walled off. I believe recently Russia tested unplugging their country from the internet. The EU is putting up digital barriers and so on. It's kind of looking like 1984's Oceania, Eurasia, and East Asia. But before I ask you more about internet freedom, copyright, the Chinafication of the internet, the theme of this podcast is geopolitics and empire. And I know perhaps it's not the primary theme that you write about, but I still would find your insight valuable. And I wanted to get your take on the military or security connections between the internet, government, and subsequently big tech. There's some research that points to Google and Facebook being seed funded by three-letter agencies. And recently, Yasha Levin described how the internet has gone from he says that the American internet companies are not abstract global platforms, but privatized instruments of American geopolitical power. And I'm sure Russia and China leverage the internet the same way. So do you have a comment on that?
I don't know. I think we could do a whole podcast just on that subject. On the one hand, the fact that something has a military origin is not necessarily indicative of its destiny. Crazy glue has a military origin as a field suture, but, I don't think that every time I glue a broken coffee cup together that I'm somehow engaging with the military-industrial complex. But it is true that, the U.S. has had a long game of both soft and hard power, and that in particular, there is this explicit, totally not secret investment fund that called InQtel that is a creature of the CIA that exists to fund promising startups that have a national security dimension. And there's a ton of stuff that has emerged from that is both strategic for the CIA and also generally useful, including a bunch of machine vision and GIS services. I think that it's definitely the case that there's a symbiotic relationship between projects like mass surveillance and commercial surveillance. That, if you think back to, say, 1989, when the Soviet Union began to collapse, the Stasi, the German secret police, the East German secret police, was the most prolific surveillance apparatus in the world. And they employed something like 1 in 60 East Germans in the snitching project. And they arguably weren't investing enough money because they missed the fact that the wall was about to come down, and they all ended up out of a job, and some of them, in jail. And so presumably, if the test of whether or not you're surveilling enough is if the thing that you're hoping to prevent is prevented, and it wasn't. Now, if you go forward 25, 30 years to today, you've got the NSA surveilling effectively the whole planet at a ratio of something like 1 to 10,000 people instead of 1 to 60 people. And that 2.5 order of magnitude gain in efficiency is largely down to the proliferation of commercial surveillance platforms. That the fact that we buy phones and then pay the phone bills to generate the data that tracks us and that also maps out our social relationships and so on. That basically makes it cost effective to undertake these global surveillance projects. And it's a kind of, democratic market equivalent to the Cultural Revolution, when the Chinese state would kidnap your father, put a bullet through his head, and send you a bill for the bullet. We get spied on all the time, and we pay our phone bills. And it's not as immediately dangerous, but I think that there have been plenty of people who've been ensnared in this, for whom it was just as consequential as being executed in the Cultural Revolution. And so, to the extent that we hope that our states are going to be wise moderators of the power of the platforms, they have this deep conflict of interest, where preserving the surveilling capability of the platforms is absolutely essential to preserving their own surveilling capability.
And speaking of the state being able to regulate these big tech companies, people are now talking about breaking up Facebook and Amazon, and we have this problem now of their business models, as you've mentioned, and this surveillance capitalism, our consumer rights, our privacy. And you've talked about the problem of the lack of antitrust and this monopolization. And as an American, I've always admired our antitrust history of breaking up Standard Oil back in the day and AT&T. And as I mentioned, we had a good competitive, I think, free market run of the internet for 20 years, but now we're veering toward this kind of oligarchy and monopoly capitalism. So what are your thoughts here?
Well, I think that it's a mistake to assume that this is a problem of tech as opposed to a problem of capitalism itself. Tech is coterminal with the growth of neoliberal capitalism. The first commercial PC, the Apple II Plus, the first successful PC, came into existence while Ronald Reagan was on the campaign trail. And, effectively, Reagan's first act when he takes office is to enact radical reforms of antitrust law along lines suggested by this fabulous extremist called Robert Bork, who's probably best known today for failing to get Senate confirmation for a seat on the Supreme Court. And Bork made up a completely fictional legislative history of antitrust law, in which the Sherman Act was not created by a Congress that was worried about monopolies. That Congress's only goal was to prevent tangible consumer harms in the form of high prices. And that if you were creating a monopoly, but you didn't immediately raise prices on consumers, you were not violating antitrust law. And this bizarre theory that's, sort of wrong on its face, became a darling of a global neoliberal movement, and was something that found a fertile home in Canada under Brian Mulroney, and in the UK under Margaret Thatcher, and in the US under Reagan. And, 40 years later, it's true that big tech has become incredibly monopolized. As they say, there was a time when the internet didn't just consist of 5 giant services filled with screenshots from the other 4, and that day is long behind us. But it's not just big tech, right? Logistics and shipping, down to 2 or 3 companies, DHL, FedEx, and UPS. Farm equipment, down to a couple of companies. Seed, down to a couple of companies. Energy, steel, rail, automotive. Very famously now, since John Oliver did a segment on it, we're down to 1 professional wrestling league, down from dozens of them 30 years ago. And that professional wrestling league's owner is worth $3.5 billion. He gives lavishly to people like Donald Trump, who promised to continue eroding antitrust laws. And he gets, because there's no competition, he gets to class his workers as contractors. He doesn't give them medical insurance. And that's why professional wrestlers are dropping dead in their 40s and 50s and have to use GoFundMe to raise the money to die with dignity. And so, I think that if this were about something like the unique power of surveillance capitalism, or the unique benefits of network effects, or the unique benefits of first mover advantage, or any of those other things that people say are why tech got so concentrated, then tech would be more concentrated than everyone else. But tech is just middling concentrated. And tech's leaders, they're not worse than everyone else. They're just as bad as everyone else. Everyone has got good and bad nature in them, and firms are liable to capture by the selfish as well as by the noble. And when there is no competition, particularly the selfish gain ground, because being selfish and corrupt is more profitable, provided that your customers can't take their business elsewhere. And so we see this in every single industry.
And I wanted to look at some of the places where tech is going wrong. We're looking at now, I think somebody did a study about content creators, independent content creators on YouTube, and how they helped build the platform, and it now seems they're being marginalized, and how traditional media is now becoming more prominent on YouTube. And then this idea of the Chinafication of the internet. So we all know how the system is in China, the Great Firewall. They have this kind of dystopian Sesame credit system straight out of the TV show Black Mirror. And it seems like this is also slowly finding its way into the West. There's Andrew Yang, I think, the U.S. presidential candidate, who has proposed some kind of social credit system to be used in New York. U.S. tech companies seem to be deplatforming some voices of dissent from both the left and the right. And we see the EU copyright directive seemingly laying down a digital iron curtain. I'm here in Kazakhstan, where there is light censorship of the internet and mobile communications. And in New Zealand, after this recent terror attack, they've passed some of these laws that I guess can get you in jail for posting certain things online. So where do you see all of this going?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's an element of like being the old lady who swallows the spider to catch the fly, and then having to swallow a bird to catch the spider. So in allowing the firms to become so big, we have, and allowing them to monopolize their sectors, right, by buying all their competitors. If you look at, say, Facebook, Facebook lost 15 million users, mostly age 13 to 34 last year in America, but they all ended up on Instagram. And, prior to the borkification of Antitrust, Facebook wouldn't have been allowed to buy Instagram. People would have been able to express their preferences by taking their business elsewhere. So now that there's really only one place where everyone goes, and you have, for example, Facebook with 2.3 billion users, you have this chaos where firms can't effectively police their users' activities. And the mistakes that they make are so consequential that they spark a demand that something be done. But because it's outside of our Overton window to imagine making them smaller so that, for example, there isn't one place where a terrorist can stream an attack that 2.3 billion people can see it, and there isn't one search engine whose choices about who goes on the front page effectively ends up determining what we believe to be true, and there isn't one social platform where if you're harassed, you either stay and be a part of the conversation and bear the harassment, or leave and be banished from the public eye. Because we're not willing to consider that breakup, we end up with these other proposals that fall into a kind of syllogism. Something must be done. Okay, now I've done something. A little like the post 9/11 measures of taking off our shoes, or any of the other things that we've done since then that have had no real meaningful effect on aviation security. And this something must be done, there I've done something thinking often manifests itself in the form of a very high set of compliance burdens for the existing platforms, which are often cheered on by critics of big tech who are like, well, if Facebook has to spend $100 million to protect copyright, I'm glad of it, because anything that punishes Facebook is okay with me. Those guys are terrible. But the reality is that Facebook, for example, implementing the EU's copyright filters, which will cost hundreds of millions of dollars, the very minimal analog to it that YouTube built Content ID was $100 million, and it does a tiny fraction of what the copyright directive contemplates. If Facebook does spend that, the one thing that they can be guaranteed is that they're never going to have to worry about competition from a European firm, because there just aren't any European companies with hundreds of millions of euros to spend on copyright filters. And so with no competition, Facebook and Google and the other big platforms are only going to become more abusive, and they're going to have more influence on policy outcomes, because one of the things about concentrated industries is that they lobby really well. When everyone who runs an industry can fit around a single boardroom table, as they did after the inauguration, when all of big tech's leaders gathered at Trump Tower and literally fit around one modestly sized boardroom table in Trump Tower, then they can collude, right? Thousands of people have a hard time colluding. Half a dozen people find it pretty straightforward to forge their common interests. This is one of the reasons that you see telecoms making such enormous gains despite the obvious incorrectness of allowing them to practice network discrimination and the widespread popular support for network neutrality. They present a united front. No one defects from telecoms when the regulator gathers them to ask them what the best rule is. And with that united front, they get better policy outcomes that they favor more. And so, this is the thing that we're getting with big tech, is this willingness to bind them to perform these state-like duties that banish all competitors. And these state-like duties, because they're asking for the impossible, right? For a thoughtful review of every word, picture, video, audio clip, code snippet, and Minecraft skin emitted by 2.3 billion people, then what you end up with is kind of the nearest equivalent, which is the thoughtless machine-based automated review of all of that speech. And the outcome of that is that millions and millions of acts of legitimate expression end up getting suppressed either deliberately or accidentally. So, deliberately, Facebook and YouTube have taken to removing evidence of terrorist atrocities, even though those same videos and still images are widely used by open source investigators who gather data on the perpetrators of human rights crimes that are then used by prosecutors to bring the perpetrators to justice. And then inadvertently, we see lots and lots of instances in which things that are not infringements or not illegal get swept up in these automated dragnets. So for example, if you are criticizing a book and you include its cover, you might have your post taken down, even though that's a legitimate use of the work. More recently on Boing Boing, the website I co-own, we had a takedown notice for the cover of a book that had been posted to advertise an event that we were doing to promote that book. And it was just sent automatically by Amazon's service. It was an Amazon self-published book that one of my co-editors was a great booster of and wanted to help promote. And so she did an event with the person who created the book. And so, these automated systems end up taking down huge amounts of content, and the criteria on which they're being asked to block content are getting wider and wider and more abstract. So things like the images of the sexual abuse of children are relatively unambiguous, but there's still some ambiguity around the edges. We've seen those filters that are supposed to remove those images used to remove the iconic photo of the young Vietnamese girl running away naked from a napalm attack on her village. We saw it used to take down the cover of an album by a rock and roll band, and ended up blocking all of Wikipedia in the UK briefly, and so on. But for all that, it's still a pretty narrow category with pretty well-defined contours. Compare that to something like copyright infringement, or even more broadly, extremist content, or even more broadly, hate speech. These are things that reasonable people disagree about all the time, but also that computers are really, really bad at figuring out. Can a computer tell if you're using a racial slur because you are a member of that racial group who was recounting an incident in which you were verbally harassed, and you're saying, this is what that policeman called me, and someone using the slur in order to actually victimize someone else on the service? Software is not only incapable of doing it, software is like nowhere near capable of making those fine-grained determinations. Like it's an absolute fantasy to think that we could ever build software in the foreseeable future that could make those distinctions. And so what you end up with is this ever-widening constellation of criteria that we're filtering speech for, even as the internet is becoming more concentrated, because only a small number of firms can afford to implement those filters, and even as it's becoming more consequential for our lives. The internet is absorbing every activity that we do. Right now, everything we do involves the internet, and it's pretty clear that very soon everything we do is going to require the internet. And so to be eroding the internet's sort of democratic control and also its openness, which is already, too narrow by far, even as it's becoming more important, it's just a recipe for disaster.
if there is no if antitrust doesn't happen to break up some of the monopoly power, I mean, what are some alternatives? Do we go to alternate platforms? I mean, what do people do?
Well, I think, this may not be the most popular view with people who are on my side, but I think alternate platforms are dead in the water until and unless we can make an important change in our rules. So when you look at the history of minority platforms that have succeeded, what you find is that inevitably in that history, there's something called adversarial interoperability. So think of when the Mac was this minority platform whose share price, whose parent company's share price was in the toilet, and that was very, very hard to use because everyone you needed to collaborate with couldn't read or write the files that you made and vice versa. And Apple had this switch campaign in 2002 where they said, Apples are much easier to use than you think, and if you switch to Mac OS, you'll still be able to talk to your friends on Windows. And then they threw a ton of engineering resources into reverse engineering Microsoft's crown jewels, the Office suite, Word, Excel, PowerPoint, and they made their equivalent, sheet or Numbers, Pages, and Keynote. And these programs, they read and write Microsoft's file formats. And even though Microsoft kind of played dirty afterwards and continued to change these file formats to break compatibility, Apple just tasked enough engineers to the project that every time Microsoft broke the experience of Mac users and their Windows collaborators, Apple unbroke it really quickly with a set of patches. And after a while, there were so many Microsoft users who were dependent on Apple compatibility because they sat up or downstream from someone who used a Mac for document creation, that every time Microsoft broke Mac compatibility, they punished Windows users, not Mac users. And Microsoft was eventually cornered and had to basically cut it out. And today, we don't think anything of the fact that you can use Google Docs or Apple's application suite or LibreOffice, which used to be called OpenOffice, or Microsoft's Office products, and that the documents just more or less seamlessly interchange. It's been years, for example, since I sent a LibreOffice document to my publisher and had them say, I'm sorry, I can't make any sense of this. They're a Windows shop with a bunch of Mac machines that are used for layout. I use Linux, and we just all talk to each other with no problems. And that adversarial interoperability carried over through the story of the internet. So, very famously, search engines routinely impersonated different kinds of browsers to foil the attempt of websites to show search engines different versions of their pages based on whether or not this was a human being or a search engine crawler showing them, sometimes to elude indexing, sometimes to corrupt the indexing so that they would get a higher search rank. And Google and Microsoft and even Alta Vista and their earlier precursors, they all developed ways of impersonating browsers so that the website would not know that they were being indexed by search engines. And then, Facebook, when they launched, they had this huge problem, which was that everybody who might be a Facebook user was already a MySpace user. And they didn't want to start using Facebook until all of their friends on MySpace were also using Facebook. This kind of collective action problem is often present in new technology, and it's what's sometimes called the network effect problem, because every new user on Facebook makes Facebook more valuable. And until you have a critical mass of users on a new platform, that platform is effectively valueless. And the way that Facebook resolved this problem of MySpace's indomitable lead was by devising a tool that allowed Facebook users to automatically have their MySpace messages brought into their Facebook inbox. It was an impersonation tool that would pretend to be them to MySpace's service and bring in their waiting messages, let them reply to those messages, and then push the replies back out to MySpace. And this converted MySpace's advantage of incumbency into a disadvantage, because now you had one place where every possible Facebook user had been conveniently gathered and organized by Facebook's largest rival. And Facebook could make a tool to liberate those people from MySpace and bring them into Facebook without making them choose between Facebook or MySpace. They could live in both worlds. Now, within a few years of that, Facebook actually sued a competitor of theirs called Power Ventures that built exactly the same tool. They advanced a radical theory of the interpretation of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. They paid a lot of money to get law review professors or law review articles written that supported this theory. They hired some very good lawyers. The world had become a lot more concentrated, and we were much more comfortable with the idea that some firms are too big to fail and they shouldn't be challenged. And long story short, Facebook changed the way that law is interpreted so that no one can ever do to Facebook what Facebook did to them. And so you take a minority platform today like Mastodon, which is basically a Twitter clone, and Mastodon federates. So each person or group of people runs their own Mastodon servers with their own house rules, and people can link them up, and I can read your Mastodon server through my account, and you can read mine through your account, and we can either federate together or disaggregate, so we can have lots of different Mastodon networks. And there's no reason you couldn't read Mastodon through Twitter. In fact, Mastodon's API is based on the old Twitter API, which Twitter subsequently shut down. Except that Twitter doesn't allow you to. And so you have to make a choice. Do you want to be on Twitter, or do you want to be on Mastodon, or do you want to answer two social telephones? And most people just end up sticking with Twitter, even though there's lots of reasons not to like Twitter, right? And there are lots of people who would like to be able to stay in touch with their friends on Twitter, but not be bound to using Twitter warts and all, for whom Mastodon federated with Twitter. Mastodon as a Twitter reading app would be an incredibly powerful value proposition. But there is no future for Mastodon without that kind of interoperability, right? No one is going to make that leap, right? It's a collective action problem with no easy solution. And maybe we could have some kind of pledge bank thing where, I say I will leave Twitter forever once a million of my friends, once everyone on my follower list or 80% of my follower list leaves too, and I could automatically link that into every one of my Twitter posts or something like that. But, ultimately, that's a very roundabout way of doing it. And it really elides like the best tool that we have for correcting anti-competitive behavior, which is just, non-consensually breaking into incumbents' tools to allow users to continuously access the parts of them they like without being bound inside of them. And restoring that, even if we don't restore antitrust, would be a huge step forward.
And I wanted to ask you about, our individual privacy online, what you think going forward are some of the biggest dangers for us as individuals. Recently, I was reading Bruce Schneier, and he posted, quote, he said, "There's nothing we can do to protect our data from being stolen by cyber criminals and others. 10 years ago, I could have given you all sorts of advice about encryption, not sending information over email, securing your web connections, and a host of other things, but most of that doesn't matter anymore. Today, your sensitive data is controlled by others, and there's nothing you can personally do to affect its security." It sounds like a bit of security nihilism, but I believe you recently wrote in Boing Boing that two-factor authentication is remarkably helpful, and you've said that crypto works. And I recently listened to an interview by NSA whistleblower Bill Binney, who has warned not to use some commercial crypto, which may have backdoors, but to create your own. So,
I did not hear Bill say that. That is terrible advice. I mean, all due respect to Bill, that is unbelievably terrible advice. Don't make your own crypto. I mean, so the thing is that, in fact, what it's like is like making your own crypto. Like that is the thing that we, oftentimes when people say like, oh, I want to perform my own brain surgery, we say, oh, what are you going to do next? Make your own crypto? The thing about crypto is that it only works if the implementation is sound. And we don't have an experimental methodology for determining a priori whether something is sound. What we have to do is subject it to adversarial review, where people try to break it. And they spend years and years trying to break it. And if they can't break it, we provisionally call it secure. It's not the case every time that it's secure. Very famously, there's this thing, Heartbleed, where we had OpenSSL, which was an open, free key security infrastructure tool that just no one had audited carefully enough to notice that it had these giant showstopper bugs for years and years and years in it. But like nobody argues that OpenSSL would be more secure if every person made their own SSL libraries and then fielded them themselves, right? Like that, or kept them proprietary so no one could look at them to make sure you hadn't made any dumb mistakes. I mean, don't make mistakes is not a plan, right? Don't make mistakes is an aspiration that you arrive at or that you realize by allowing people to find the mistakes you've made, not by just assuming that if you've committed to not making mistakes, no mistakes will be present. And I think that we can resolve Bruce's advice and my own feeling by understanding the nuance between them. So I was quoting this Google security research paper that they presented and published, in which they showed that in the real world, a bunch of pretty common measures, even measures with known attacks against them, worked surprisingly well to prevent most kinds of account takeover attacks. So, for example, if you just use two-factor authentication, even the weak two-factor authentication where you get SMS'd six-digit code when you try to set up a new account on a new device, that is effective at stopping 100% of automated attacks, most targeted manual attacks, not targeted attacks, and a large number of targeted attacks as well. And then when you use in-app verification like Google Authenticator or Authy, you get much more security. It goes up to like 100%, 100%, and like 90%. And so this is like an incredibly effective set of tools at preventing account takeovers. And I think Bruce would agree with that conclusion. In fact, I might even found the study on his blog. The issue that Bruce is raising is that while this will prevent people from taking over your account without the cooperation of the platform that's holding your data, what this doesn't do is stop the people who work for that platform or who own it from abusing your data. And so it stops the system from working unintentionally against your privacy, but there are many ways in which the system is designed to intentionally deprive you of your privacy. And that is a matter of both regulation and competition. So some of these systems we know are designed to prevent us from having privacy. And, we strive to find ways to overcome that, but ultimately it's very hard, right? There's not really any competition. They're often the only game in town, and you just you take what you're given. And so on the one hand, if there was better regulation, including antitrust rules that would force them to split up, but also rules making them liable for capturing the full damages in a breach. Oftentimes when a company breaches your data, they're only liable for actual damages. So you have to show that you lost money after your data was leaked. And oftentimes that monetary loss comes a long way down the line in combination with other breaches. So, the people who are weaponizing a breach will take data from that one company leaked about you and merge it with data that another company leaked about you and use that to, for example, answer your secret questions in an authentication system, or to derive your home address, or to de-anonymize an anonymized data set and then blackmail you or attack you in some other way. And so, this like probabilistic or stochastic form of damage is not one that our courts recognize in privacy, even though it's one that they recognize in many other domains. Like if you leak dioxin into the drinking water, we don't know who's going to get cancer from that dioxin, but we know people are getting cancer, and we fine you accordingly, right? We don't say, well, you'll have to pay for anyone who is upset enough about dioxin that they buy a Brita filter, right? We say you're going to have to pay for the probability that a certain number of people who live in this water basin are going to end up with terrible cancer, and your fine is going to reflect that. And we could easily do that with privacy breaches. When Home Depot leaked 80 million users' credit card numbers, we fined them about 35 cents per user, and a third of that, 10 cents per user, went towards a voucher for free credit monitoring services. And instead, we might have fined them like, say, 1% of the real estate holdings of all of the users that were breached, on the grounds that, about 1% of them are going to end up losing their houses eventually because of that breach. And that would really severely constrain the kind of data collection that firms engage in. But really, it's inconceivable that we'll get those kinds of rules for so long as the industry is so concentrated that they lobby and they speak with one voice, and also that they're so profitable that they have all this money left over to lobby. Because one of the things about very concentrated industries is that the firms within them command what economists call monopoly rents, right? Facebook is posting between like 55 and 37% year-on-year growth in revenues because they don't have any competitors eroding their most profitable lines of work. If they were posting, 6% profits and 1% annual growth, they wouldn't be able to afford the kind of lobbying operations that they engage in to prevent anyone from ever making them liable for the kinds of damages that are incurred when breaches inevitably take place.
Before I ask you about your science fiction, is there any final thought you leave us with, whether it's regarding the EU copyright directive or the future and the fight for internet freedoms?
Well, I'd say that the most exciting thing on the horizon right now is the idea that a lot of different constituencies who are fighting over a lot of different things are all recognizing that they're fighting different aspects of the same problem, this market concentration problem. There's a copyright professor and scholar named James Boyle at Duke University who talks about the advent of the term ecology and what an enormous effect it had on the perception of what was at stake and on the efficacy of the people who were fighting to improve the quality of our environment. So before the term ecology was coined, there were people who cared about saving old growth forests, and there were people who cared about saving whales, and there were people who cared about freshwater drinking water quality, and there were people who cared about air quality and so on. But they didn't all really understand how they were fighting the same fight. They couldn't make the connection between them. There wasn't a word that grouped all of these disparate fights into one domain. And the advent of the term ecology was a radical game changer because it put all of these people on the same side. So, I will help you fight to save whales because I know you will help me fight to save the ozone layer. Even though, you care about whales for your reasons and I care about ozone for my reason, we understand that we're all on the same side. And increasingly, there are people who are worried about the fact that their insulin now costs 1,000% more than it did 10 years ago. And they're having to make choices about whether they're going to go blind or whether they're going to starve to death because they can't afford enough insulin to keep themselves healthy. And there are people who care about the fact that their family farm is now totally beholden to John Deere. And John Deere is non-consensually extracting data about their crops from them and selling it into the futures market and won't let them fix their own tractors and so on. And there are people who care about market concentration because they're professional wrestling fans. And the people that they love are dying slow, humiliating deaths because there's only one league and they can't get justice out of it. And there are people who care about market concentration in big tech. And we are starting to all wake up and recognize that we're all on the same side. That this is not a fight about whether Apple has one app store, and it's not a fight about whether there are only 3 places that you can sell the hogs that you raise to who have made the prices bottom out so that you're starving to death so that you can feed your pigs. This common cause has the potential to make change where these atomized fights didn't. Right? We are more powerful together than we are separately.
I think that's good news. And I've followed your work in the journalist and activist realm, but have never read your science fiction. I'm a big fan of science fiction, and I guess I'll have to read your books now. You're prolific.
Yeah, I mean, why not?
Yeah. And I've listened to some of your interviews where you explain some of the stories, and they sound really hilarious, very original and thought-provoking. And can you just tell us a bit about the work you do in science fiction?
Yeah, I write science fiction novels, among other things, short stories, novellas, and so on. Some of them are young adult books and some of them are books for adults. I actually just got the proofs for my first picture book for small children. And I've also had some middle grades graphic novels out and so on. The latest book is called Radicalized. It's 4 novellas that, if they have like a summary, it would be maybe something like this will all be so great if we don't screw it up, which is really how I feel about tech. And so, there are a mix of stories about people seizing the means of computation and achieving a kind of technological self-determination and making their lives much better, and people who are unable to pull that off and as a result, their lives are much worse. So, the first story in it is called Unauthorized Bread, and it's being made into a TV show by Topic, the people who publish The Intercept. And the premise is that people who are living in refugee housing, subsidized refugee housing, are trapped in a kind of Internet of Things nightmare where all of the appliances in their homes are designed to extract as much revenue as possible from them. So, the toaster will only toast authorized bread that's identified by an optical sensor on the front of the toaster. And that requires that you buy all your bread from one company that charges a huge premium for it. Likewise, the dishwasher only washes authorized dishes, and the washing machine will only wash authorized clothing. And, this is bad enough, but the firms that make these go out of business because they're owned by sleazy hedge funds that financially engineer, all these debt bombs that drive them into bankruptcy. And then all the appliances stop working altogether. And the people in the building, rather than just accepting that they no longer have working appliances, they go on the dark net. They figure out how to jailbreak their devices, and they enter a kind of golden age in which they have total control over all of these technologies in their lives to their enormous betterment. But then the firms that made these appliances restructure out of bankruptcy, and the people in the building realize that if they don't restore their devices to factory defaults, they face the risk of being discovered by the device telemetry, and that would be a felony under the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. And then because they're refugees, committing a felony could result in their deportation. And since they were fleeing certain death, being deported could cost them their lives. And so the stakes get very high, and it becomes a kind of fight between the people who first engineered this woman, Salima, who's a Libyan refugee, and the young children of the building who were her kind of army of Baker Street irregulars who she taught to do the jailbreaking and who've been, seizing the means of computation and realizing the power of being in charge of your technological destiny, and who are unwilling to compromise and restore everything back to its factory defaults. And it's a story about this very high stakes way that the unexpected consequences of cabining people's behavior with technological controls can spin out of control and become life or death matters, where people's willingness to submit to control by third parties becomes more than a matter of human dignity, but also a matter of just your freedom.
I hope the future doesn't look anything like that. And when I said very original, well, I meant it because I've never heard any plot line like that. And finally, where can people best find you online?
Well, I'm usually pretty easy to find. If you type Cory into Google, I'm usually the first result, Cory. I'm Doctorow on Twitter, and I'm one of the owners of a website called Boing Boing at boingboing.net, which is a sort of daily tech, culture, and politics site. My personal site is at craphound.com, crap like poop, hound like dog. And although all of my books are published by Macmillan through Tor, which is the largest science fiction publisher in the world, you can also buy them from me as ebooks without any digital rights management, without any license agreement. And I get the money that Amazon would normally take, and then I send the remainder to my publisher, who then takes my royalty share and sends it back to me. All the books are there, as well as audiobooks. Will Wheaton reads several of my audiobooks. He's a very, very good reader. There you go.
I would also recommend people check out the Electronic Frontier Foundation. I'm a fan of what the work they do. And again, thanks for your time and the work that you do.
Oh, well, thank you very much. It was absolutely my pleasure.
I hope you enjoyed this Geopolitics and Empire podcast and interview. I would like to remind you that our website is geopoliticsandempire.com, and you can sign up for our mailing list that goes out each weekend with the latest podcast and a long collection of important news headlines. It's good to sign up for the newsletter in case we experience censorship and deplatforming. You can help the Geopolitics and Empire podcast by subscribing to and interacting with all of our channels such as YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Gab, Minds, and Steemit. You can also help us by leaving a rating and review on your favorite podcast platforms such as iTunes, CastBox, Stitcher, Spreaker, and so on. Finally, if you value our work and our mission and would like to see us continue interviewing experts from across the political spectrum, please consider leaving a one-time donation via PayPal or Bitcoin, or becoming a regular monthly supporter on our Patreon. All the links can be found on geopoliticsandempire.com. Thanks for listening.